Welcome to Beyond the Surface. We highlight unique voices in architecture and design. We share their stories to uncover who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez. Today's episode is called Looking Back, Going Forward with our guests, Elizabeth Blasius and Jonathan Solomon. Elizabeth Blasius and Jonathan Solomon are founders and partners of Preservation Futures, a firm focused on design, advocacy, and consultancy at the intersection of historic preservation and contemporary practice. Elizabeth Blasius is an architectural historian and writer who has worked extensively in the public and private sectors, advising clients on compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. She specializes in how preservation policies influence recovery and mitigation of historical environments following climate and other destructive events. Elizabeth writes a monthly column for Mass Context and has previously served as the Midwest editor in the Architects newspaper. She has been published in Bloomberg City Lab, Curbed, the Chicago Tribune, and Block Club Chicago. She has served on the Illinois Historic Sites Advisory Council, the board of Docomomo, U.S. Chicago, and other preservation organizations. Jonathan Solomon, FAIA, is a professor of architecture at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and partner of Preservation Futures. His work spans adaptive reuse design, preservation consultation, and scholarship. Jonathan has extensive international experience in arts leadership, including leading the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong and serving as Director of Architecture, Interior Architecture, and Design Objects at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He was the editor of 30, 60, 90 books with Princeton Architectural Press and curated the U.S. Pavilion at the 2010 Venice Architectural Biennial. Most recently, he co-curated Yes and the fifth cycle of Exhibit Columbus in Indiana. Well, I am excited to talk to you guys today. It'll be my first time interviewing two people at the same time. So thank you for being here on the podcast today. How are you guys feeling?
Oh, I'm feeling good.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So excited to be here. You've really had some great people on this podcast, and we're just so excited to be a part of the continuum.
I'm glad that you guys have listened to the episodes, and I'm excited to get your guys' stories too. So you guys will be also one of the great people on our podcast. So I'll start with Elizabeth first. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you grew up?
I grew up in Troy, Michigan, which is a suburb of the city of Detroit. It's a really kind of an unremarkable suburb. There wasn't really anything of architectural distinction in Troy, aside from the office of Minoru Yamasaki, who created an office in Troy after getting the commission for the World Trade Center. And that was kind of a part of my understanding of architecture early. Neither of my parents were interested in architecture, but my dad was a mechanic, my mom was a secretary. But there was always a focus and an interest in my house in terms of Detroit history. And Minoru Yamasaki having so many buildings in downtown Detroit and then also having this sort of international reputation as the architect of the World Trade Center was really kind of a part of how I understood the importance of history and where my interest came from. The first thing that I ever wanted to be in my life was an Egyptologist. When I was 6 years old, my mom took me to an exhibit at the Detroit Institute of Arts called Cleopatra's Egypt, Age of the Ptolemies. And I remember the title of that particular exhibit because when I went to the exhibit, I got the poster, and I had the poster up on my wall for years and years as a little kid. And the poster was really exciting. It was like this bust of Cleopatra with like all of these, and it was gold leafed, this poster, lots of hieroglyphics around it. And Egyptology was the first sort of ology that I ever kind of learned about. And it just sounded so interesting to me that you could be into a thing like ancient Egypt and sort of create an entire career around that. Troy was really architecturally unremarkable, but I did sort of see architecture that I was interested in when my dad and I would go visit my grandmother. My grandmother lived for over 60 years in a house in Highland Park, Michigan. Highland Park is a village inside the city of Detroit. And in the 19 teens, it had one of the sort of highest per capita incomes of places all over the United States because Ford had their headquarters there. So there were lots of Ford executives in the 19 teens that had built up homes and cultural institutions. And then, of course, the infrastructure, the civic infrastructure, libraries, schools sort of followed that high income. But by the time my grandfather bought the house there in the 1950s, Highland Park was fairly run down. They had 3 children, and the infrastructure and the architecture was much further dilapidated by the time I had experienced it for myself in the 1980s and 1990s. And there was also a good deal of disinvestment happening in Highland Park. And I would go to Highland Park with my dad, and my dad would cut the grass, and I'd tool around my grandmother's house in the attic, in the basement, where there were items that belonged to my grandmother and my grandfather who had passed on, but also both my grandparents' parents and then also my grandparents' siblings. So it was just sort of, the house was a collection of just all of these items from people that had died, and it was just sort of accumulating at my grandmother's house. But Highland Park was also particularly interesting to me because the architecture it was clear that at one point it was very, very fancy, but it had experienced civic disinvestment, the elements of sort of racism that you're not sort of told when you see a dilapidated area or a place that's disinvested. It wasn't immediately clear to me that the reason why Highland Park looked like that was because of racism. So that's something that I found out later, but my interest in old architecture really came from visiting my grandmother. And after my dad and I would visit my grandmother, we'd sort of drive around and we'd look at the schools and we'd see the churches and we'd see, some of them had been in really terrible condition and had been disused and vacant, and just sort of seeing all of that and not really understanding what conditions had brought the built environment to that was really interesting to me. I sort of started engaging my interest in architecture through creative work. So I was in lots of art classes in high school, and the thing that was interesting to me was like drawing buildings or photographing old dilapidated buildings. My interest was initially like visual and creative, but then I just really wanted to kind of know more about why the situation was happening. Not so much, I wanted to fix it, but I really wanted to know the why.
In your story, I really like the way that you started it. First, you talked about your admiration for architecture. Then you talked about first him at a museum, your admiration for history. And slowly in your story, it started to mix understanding your environment, where you grew up, and then even like scavenging through your grandmother's home and finding these little pockets of history that you were able to like question, and also understanding the paths you went in high school. So I really liked how you talked about it.
Old things have always been really interesting to me. It's not really the fetishizing of old things, it's just like what the history can kind of teach us, and I feel like you can endlessly go back to different historical topics, whether it's, architecture or my own family history, and learn something new.
I love like how like everything has a story. Like being able to understand what that story is behind something so small and something so big as a building is pretty impressive. So for Jonathan, let's hear more about your story as well.
Thank you. My movement into architecture as an interest is maybe a little bit less heroic than Elizabeth's in the sense that it's largely hereditary. I grew up in a family of architects. My father was an architect. His father was an architect. My mother's father was an architect. And actually, both of my grandfathers practiced with their brother, who was also an architect. So this is sort of a sense within the household that art, culture were kind of understood and appreciated through the lens in which largely mid-century architects were trained to engage them. I don't remember ever having an idea of a thing that I would do other than be an architect. And I don't have any particular sense of being forced into it or regretting it. To the extent that it was an inheritance, it was one that I willingly and lovingly took on. But what that meant in practical terms took a very long time for me to figure out. So following Elizabeth's lead, I'll say, as a child, my parents divorced when I was young, when I was about first grade. And my father moved 4 blocks away. I grew up in Chicago. We lived in East Lakeview. And I remember that the walk between the two houses was revealing for me. I'd grown up in that neighborhood. I'd walked around it. But understanding that I could get from one environment that was home to another environment that was home by taking a certain path through the city, then coming to understand that there were alternative paths that also led between those two places, but took me past other things, beginning to kind of notice and understand the way that the city operated and the way that I could engage with it and the way that the city was a kind of extension of the home, or the city was an extension of my school. I was in the same school from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So I was one building, essentially, that I became very familiar with over that time, in the way that I became very familiar ultimately with the walk, right, between school and home, or the bus ride. It was the late 70s and the early 1980s. My mother was particularly controlling of her environment and of my movement through the world, but there were still some gaps in that time, right? Like I was put on the CTA very early. Like third grade, I was taking the CTA to and from school, and that opened up a kind of window to engage with the city on my own terms. I realized at a certain point that if I told my mother I was going out to ride my bike, that she would be fine. Like this was a thing that I could say I was going to go do, and I would not be confronted or stopped or interfered with. And so I spent a lot of time between, the ages of 8 and 18 on my bike riding around the city. And I was a timid child, so it took time. Like this, like it emerged over time. I would sort of gradually push out against my comfort zones, but I would ride all the way up and down the lakefront. I would ride into neighborhoods and explore them. And, it became the city, and the built environment became the kind of framework or terms around which I wanted to understand and engage the world. And I think that's the path that led me into a decision to study urbanism, be an urban studies major in college. With a bunch of architects in the family comes some sagely advice. And so everyone I knew, more or less, told me that architecture was a very difficult profession. And maybe I'd want to keep my options open. Maybe I would be interested in studying this or studying that. And so I decided to follow that advice and to begin in college by studying in a kind of broad undergraduate major at Columbia University that brought together government, economics, a little bit of design, to understand the city as a mechanism, right? As like an organism, and not just as a physical mechanism. Or if I was fascinated by the physical stuff of the city, what were the forces that led to that stuff being shaped the way it was? And ultimately, what ways did I feel like I could effectively engage them? By the time I got to graduate school, I was still kind of figuring out that while I loved talking about buildings and listening to people talk about buildings and being in them and understanding them and discovering things about them, I didn't particularly love designing them. It wasn't my own critiques in graduate school that took up most of my energy or that I was most excited about or engaged in. It was the critiques of my classmates, which I think in retrospect, I must have appeared very catty to my classmates because I really was invested in what was being said in their crits, right? And I really wanted to join in, right? Which wasn't really a thing at the time. This was still in the end of the long 90s, I would say, right? So these critiques were teacher-led. They were primarily a conversation between the teachers with the work of the student as a kind of a prop, right? But I was fascinated by it from the standpoint of discourse, of the fact that this work had meaning, that people would take seriously and consider, and then re-leverage towards other parts of the world in order to understand them. I was fascinated by the politics of it, right? By the relationships between the teachers and the students that you could kind of see being played out in those conversations. By lineage, by the kind of movement of ideas between colleagues or between teachers and students, and only kind of secondarily interested in my own performance within that arena. And I think if I can track back to my earlier childhood, I mentioned that my father was an architect. Later, he was a director of the Graham Foundation. He was director of the Graham Foundation for almost 15 years, from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. He would come home and talk about the projects that the Graham was supporting. This was very easy to tell. He would be most excited about the chances that he had to, with a little bit of support, objectively speaking, give someone the opportunity to pursue a deep interest in a kind of a side topic, right? A niche topic, we might say today, right? Or something that was understudied or underappreciated, but that they were really committed to and really had something to say about. And I think that that built for me a kind of preference or excitement at engaging in discourse, in hearing what people had to say about the knowledge they'd discovered over and above the actual experience of a given building. But it also predisposed me to the underdog in that discourse, right? It predisposed me to be suspicious of mainstreams, at worst maybe to be a little cynical, but at best to be aware and attendant to the kind of less mainstream ideas, or the ideas that took a little more time to understand and value.
So what I'm hearing is once you entered college, you started to understand what it meant to really challenge ideas and question them and really enjoy those conversations, which is exciting. Like, I love questioning things, if you guys can't tell. And I feel like that relates a little bit to the work that you do right now. But before we get into that, Elizabeth, tell us also about some of the things you learned how to challenge in college.
When it was time to go to college, I based my choice really heavily on not wanting to be in the suburbs anymore. So I visited 3 schools. I visited the Savannah College of Art and Design. I visited the Center for Creative Studies in Detroit. And I visited SAIC in Chicago. And Chicago really appealed to me. Something about the independence of the city, the fact that I could basically leave the dorms or leave my apartment and go explore on my own using the CTA, taking the bus, really appealed to me. So Chicago seemed like a really natural choice. And it was also close enough to home and far enough away so that if something had happened and I needed to be home on the train in 5 hours, I could do that. But I could also sort of maintain my independence in Chicago. And I'm, sort of from a family, a more extended family where most folks stayed in Michigan. First, neither my mother nor my father went to college, so it was a big deal for me and my immediate family to go to college. SAIC really seemed like a good choice for me. I went to SAIC to pursue a Bachelor of Fine Arts, and when I started SAIC, I was doing painting and drawing and photography and just sort of enjoying all of these creative pursuits. So SAIC kind of really gave me the opportunity to explore different creative mediums, but I was always kind of more attracted and inspired by things that already existed, whether it was architecture or music. In high school, I played guitar, and I was never particularly interested in, the music that I could make on my own, but I was very interested in the music that other people were making. And it was sort of the same way with my interest in architecture. I feel like a lot of people are presented with architecture as like, you're going to be an architect. That's the one sort of choice. And there's, in reality, so many other ways to engage with architecture. There's architectural journalism, there's historic preservation, there's education. But that really wasn't apparent to me until I started taking classes at SAIC and became aware of the historic preservation department. So as an undergraduate, I started taking classes at the graduate level in historic preservation, which was an option for me. And opening my eyes up to historic preservation as a field, this is something that you can do. You can sort of study existing buildings and architecture and the existing history of the built environment. And that was something that really appealed to me in kind of the same way that Egyptology appealed to me, that it was this really specialized profession that just seemed so cool and something that could really dig my teeth into. Part of my college experience was working through college. So I was 21 and I got a job at the Atwood Cafe in the Hotel Burnham. And the Hotel Burnham is a building that was designed by Daniel Burnham that was renovated in the early 2000s as a hotel and a restaurant property. The Hotel Burnham was this really important keystone in terms of renovating the Loop at the turn of the 21st century. So the Loop had been really dilapidated before then, and then this developer comes in, landmarks the property, renovates the property where the Hotel Burnham and the Atwood Cafe will eventually be. So working at the Atwood Cafe really kind of allowed me to sort of connect everything in terms of the way in which I had to pay for college and the way in which I had to pay for my apartment. But it also kind of exposed me every day to this level of historic preservation that I really kind of saw as important in terms of the care of cities.
So basically, entering your guys' career, you guys were both thinking critically. You guys were both starting to question things, starting to understand the histories of things and wanting to go into that discovery. Can you talk about how that started to influence your guys' writing and your early career?
Sure. I mentioned that I was discovering in graduate school my interest in architecture, discourse, and my kind of preference for it over architectural design. Like Elizabeth said, it was still my understanding that the way to engage the field of architecture was to be an architect, right? Was to work for an architect, become licensed as an architect, and then practice architecture. And so I did begin to do that immediately after graduation, but my main focus was elsewhere. and it went into teaching, which I began teaching at the City College of New York the fall after I graduated from graduate school. So I went right into it. I'm still teaching first-year undergraduate studios today, but we'll save that for later discussion. As a graduate student, I'd started in the fall of 2001 a publication, right? We didn't have such things as podcasts back then. And in fact, it's worth noting that this was a moment where venues for publishing in architecture in the United States were at a kind of a low point, right? We were coming out of the 90s. I think, had closed by that point. Oppositions was another a kind of mainstay academic journal that had closed. But there was very little in the sense of a venue or a media for published architectural discourse. This is kind of the opposite problem of what we have now, which is that there are so many venues that it's hard to kind of value them and find the conversation that's actually meaningful in them. Our goal with what became 30, 60, 90 Books was to produce such a venue with a preference for the work of students and young professionals. And that became a nearly 15-year project. We became a nonprofit. We published first biannual journals and then later annual books. We reached a kind of apotheosis point of the project in co-presenting the U.S. Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennial in 2010 with the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. Those three territories, the architectural exhibition, the architectural publication, and the architecture school, really were where I was invested as someone in my early career. And the conclusion of the shortest possible amount of time that I felt that I had to work for an architect in order to be eligible to become licensed, I was casting around for full-time teaching jobs and saw that my former dean at Princeton University, Ralph Lerner, had recently become Dean of the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. And I called him on a whim. I called him the afternoon that I learned this. It was a Friday afternoon. It was around 4 p.m. And I remember explicitly thinking, I mentioned earlier, I was a timid child. I was also a timid young professional. I was nervous to use the phone. So I thought, well, maybe I'll take a nap. Maybe I'll call him on Monday. No, I better do it now, right? So I got Ralph 30 minutes before he was leaving his office to get on a plane to fly to Hong Kong. And he said, yes, of course I remember you, because I introduced myself in an awkward, don't you remember me? I was your student 3 years ago. And he said, send your things in, send in your materials. I'll see what I can do. And 4 months later, I was recently married. Each of us packed up a suitcase and we were moving to Hong Kong for me to teach full time at HKU. And that was an extraordinary experience. The school was extraordinary. It was a moment when globalization seemed unstoppable. And the location in Hong Kong, where I could be an English-speaking, tenure-track, ultimately tenured professor at a world, frankly, leading institution, and also be on the kind of edge of the most dynamic and exciting place to be in the world of architecture and arguably in the world at the time, which was China. It was spectacular, and the students were incredible. Many of them became lifelong friends and colleagues, and the city was absolutely incredible. So from kind of learning about how to navigate the city of Chicago as like a pedestrian on foot, as a person riding a bike, I was just overwhelmed with the complexity and sophistication of Hong Kong's built environment. So I would say, like, while in Hong Kong, I did do design work. I practiced as a designer. I did work there that I was proud of, adaptive reuse work there that I was very proud of. And that work attempted to interpret historical or culturally meaningful artifacts through contemporary materials and processes and forms, which was, at the time, again, a way to get engaged in what was being talked about then in architecture schools, which was material fabrication, customization, parametric design, et cetera, without being in thrall of the mainstream contemporary idea, right?
When you started to become a teacher and you started teaching, was it because you wanted to constantly be able to continue questioning things through the students? And then moving to Hong Kong, like, because it's a different culture, the architecture is slightly different, and even the way that they teach there is different. How did that shift your perspective about architecture?
Great questions. The answer to the first question is easy, which is yes, right? Like, I went into teaching because my favorite place to be was the critique, right? And when I couldn't be there as a student anymore, I wanted to be there as a teacher. And that was actually most important to me upon leaving graduate school. It was my ability to then move into teaching and to remain within the space of the design critique. It felt more important to me, more sort of urgent than my, like, movement through the ranks of architectural design as a profession. And just as an aside, right, the publishing projects, the exhibitions were also extensions of the space of the critique. Those are spaces where the work of the architect is not only to meet the needs of the brief, but to embed their work with an idea, with meaning that is readable, visible, comprehensible, and then can be discussed and engaged, right? And I feel that way to this day. I teach that way to this day. The content of the building is more important to me than its creation, right? And that content, and getting ahead of ourselves here, but a building's content is, I think, incorrectly presented to architects in architecture schools a lot of the time as what the architect puts into it through design. Full stop, right? When in fact, buildings have long lives after the architect is done with it. And those lives are equally, if not more, fascinating. And Hong Kong, yes, I mean, my gosh, looking back at that experience, I have regrets about that experience looking back at it. And one of the regrets was the extent to which I work globally and not locally. And fundamentally, that's on me, but it was also part of the air that we were breathing, right? And part of the conversations that we were having, part of the expectations around me. But fundamentally, it's on me. I never found my way towards being a Hong Konger in Hong Kong or found a way to work specifically for Hong Kong. And the work that I did there that I think was most meaningful for me was a book called Cities Without Ground, which I wrote with Adam Frampton and Clara Wong, two close friends, a book of drawings of the three-dimensional walkways and transit systems and shopping malls and things that form a kind of three-dimensional mesh of pedestrian infrastructure through the city. And that work was very personal, and I'm very proud of it. I consider it like a kind of a parting gift, because by the time we were finished with it, I had kind of come to the realization that I had limits there and that I didn't want to be forever in a place where I was even a very welcome guest. I wanted to be somewhere where I felt I was able to embed in and be a part of. And I think that extends to students. Again, I had amazing students in Hong Kong. I've stayed in touch with a number of them. I dearly enjoyed working with them, but there were limits to what I could understand about what they were facing and tackling. And my insistence as a teacher that they understand and comprehend the world in a particular way didn't necessarily always align with what they needed or wanted. And I think in the end, I am happier, feel extraordinarily lucky to be back in Chicago, which was literally my home, but being in a place where I feel a connection and commitment to the place, and where I can meaningfully engage and support the place and not feel like I'm simply there to extract from it. I don't know if that answered your question or if that went off on a little bit of a tangent, but what I would say is the world changed, the architecture world changed significantly between when I left graduate school and when I returned to Chicago to teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And that change is something that I think the Hong Kong experience prepared me for. I think what I learned about myself and my relationship to the world and to my students and to the world of architecture, I don't want to give the impression that it was all mistake, but through some mistakes, some missed opportunities, some courses that I might have chosen to take otherwise if I had a chance to. What I learned through that experience, I think, really set me up to re-enter Chicago and the world here with a lot more openness and with a lot more of a commitment to respond to and engage the context I was in carefully.
I like how you answered that question, because I remember in the beginning you talked about like understanding the format of Chicago, riding your bike and really getting familiar with what it was to like live in the context. And even though you didn't like see it at the time, you started to actually experience that when teaching in Hong Kong. And so like understanding what it meant to be in the city and understanding also the opportunities / missed opportunities and other opportunities that you ended up taking. So Elizabeth, did you stay in Chicago or did you also leave?
I got my graduate degree from SAIC in historic preservation in 2008. And I wrote my thesis on Chicago decorative arts of the late 19th and early 20th century. And I kind of set my intentions with my thesis to work in Chicago, to be really embedded in what was happening in Chicago. But I also was like sort of open to other opportunities. So as my time in graduate school was winding down, I applied for and received an early career opportunity to go work in India for 9 months for the Indian National Trust. And it was a really incredible experience for me. I mean, first off, I'd never been outside of North America. So getting on a plane and then going to a place that I had never been to before, I did not speak Hindi, unprepared for that experience. But it ended up being a really wonderful one. The work in India consisted of documenting a medieval fort city called Jaisalmer in Rajasthan that was being affected by contemporary plumbing and tourism. So I worked alongside a group of Indian architects to document the existing condition of Jaisalmer. And the document that we put together went to the Indian National Trust and actually helped the local government of Jaisalmer decide how to mitigate the problem of modern plumbing. Before I even went to India, I was just so hyped to actually start my career in preservation in Chicago. I remember the discussion that we had in class one day about what kind of jobs will you get as a early career preservationist? And I was like, I have nothing to worry about. My thesis is awesome. It's about Chicago. I'm about to go to India for 9 months. My life is perfect and amazing. But what I found was that, I returned to Chicago from India after having this incredible experience, and I started to apply for jobs. And I applied for a job at the Landmarks Commission, didn't get it. Applied for jobs elsewhere in the city, didn't get them. Applied for jobs at architecture firms that sort of had a historic preservation component and had a sort of historic preservation division, didn't get those jobs, didn't get jobs in sort of the cultural resources management sector of historic preservation. And I was really frustrated by this. And what was happening was, 2008, it's a recession. A lot of the folks that were applying for these jobs, entry-level jobs in preservation, were getting these jobs with 10 years of experience. So I had just nothing on that. I returned to Chicago after being in India, just a little bit disheartened. I returned to the Atwood Cafe and the Hotel Burnham and continued to wait tables. And I would sort of pick up consulting gigs as I could find them. But, I began feeling very frustrated with the field that I had done everything right. So I had my degree. I had focused my thesis on a topic that I felt like was going to be important in terms of the rest of my career. And here I was just sort of minimally employed and waiting tables. And it was really, really frustrating to me. And I kind of gained, because I had that experience, a little bit of a chip on my shoulder, and also being a little bit suspicious of mainstream preservation. I didn't really feel like the field was embracing me in the way that I wanted it to, or I felt like should, in terms of someone who's early in their career, who I felt like even then I had some really interesting, provocative ideas, but there was nowhere for those ideas to go. So as sort of an act of working out this frustration, and then also kind of maybe as a little bit of a brain dump, I started a blog called Blasivations, which is a portmanteau between my last name, Blasius, preservation, and observation. And, in being minimally employed in preservation, I gave myself the opportunity to discuss through the blog what I was interested in. And it was kind of, even then, sort of informed by the professional work that I was doing, but it was not directly connected with the work that I was doing. So the Blasivations provided me with a way in which to sort of talk about preservation politics or policy, particular buildings that I found interesting, just sort of digging into the history of a building. When my career started to gain a little bit of inertia and I traveled, I would be able to sort of pick a thing as I was traveling and write about that on the blog. After enough years of sort of accumulating enough experience, I was able to quit waiting tables and just worked on preservation full time. The first kind of part of the preservation field of jobs that I got into was doing work in the telecom industry. Perhaps you'd think, what does the telecom industry have to do with historic preservation? So there's a set of federal laws under the National Environmental Policy Act, also the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, that basically says that federal agencies have to take into consideration natural and historic resources. It's a series of policies that really require you, when you're applying them, whether you're someone that works in a federal agency or someone that is a consultant, which is what I was, to really apply critical thinking. So for telecom, as a consultant, a telecom company would give me plans for a cell tower or cell equipment on a building, and I would take a look at what this particular carrier was planning to build. And then I would determine, based on what the structure was, whether it was a cell tower or just, equipment on top of a building or on the side of a building, what the requirements were in terms of how to site that thing where the client wanted it to be sited, based on federal law and then local law. So I would get these really complex architectural drawings for a cell tower, and I would have to look at them and I would have to think, okay, well, what is the project area? So I'd have to decide what the project area was. And then within that project area, I'd have to determine what kind of historic resources were in it. So using kind of critical thinking skills and researching skills that I had built in the early stages of my professional career. So I would have to go do research and figure out, are there any historic buildings or potentially historic buildings that this project might affect? And I would have to evaluate the effects of that particular cell installation on a historic building or a historic district. And the evaluation would include a visual evaluation. So how can you see the installation from this historic resource? Or what kind of direct effects does this installation have on a historic resource? So sometimes cell companies would want to just sort of bore their equipment directly into, the sides of a building. And I would have to say, no, you need to site it somewhere else because there's this historic component or the building itself is historic. It was work that at the beginning of my career was very lucrative. And I did enjoy the critical thinking and I enjoyed the travel a lot because I worked all over the United States. But it felt at times very unethical to me, because I was being often asked by the client to make decisions that were more beneficial to the cell company as opposed to the well-being of a community or the integrity of a historic resource. And that sort of started to bug me. And I remember that one of the client representatives said to me one time, Elizabeth, you work for us. You don't work for these historic buildings. And that was really frustrating to hear. And, maybe it was a little bit too idealist of me to think that I have an ethical responsibility to do good work. I have an ethical responsibility to the field and the movement of historic preservation and this knowledge to actually do work that does no harm. So I kind of got to the point where I just couldn't do that kind of cell work anymore. And it was also very high paced. The clients that I were working with were, very corporate, and that's just not sort of me. So I had an opportunity after working in telecom, because I had the policy skills and the cultural resources management skills, to work in disaster recovery. So I had an opportunity to work for FEMA as a consultant after Hurricane Harvey in 2017. That work I really sunk my teeth into. I really sort of used my skills as an architectural historian, my research skills, my critical thinking skills, my knowledge of historic resources kind of for good as opposed to for evil in the telecom industry. And I got some good advice from people who worked on natural disaster recovery to basically work your way out of the disaster. So when you arrive on the ground after climate violence hits, the idea is to basically, you work and work and work until there's no more work for you in your position. So I worked in Southeast Texas. I was based in Beaumont, Texas for 9 months after Hurricane Harvey. And that was, really beneficial experience for me to see how historic preservation interfaced with something that seemed to be, very current, climate change. What's interesting is when I took that deployment, I got the sense from folks in Chicago that kind of climate disaster would not happen in Chicago. And the experience that I was about to get was not particularly relevant, which is very interesting now, because here we are sort of less than 10 years later, and even 5 years later, it seemed like that was obviously untrue. Climate violence comes for us all eventually, whether you're a climate refugee or you're working on a natural disaster or feeling this sort of secondary effects or experiencing the secondary effects of a climate disaster. But working in disaster recovery really kind of keyed me into this idea that preservation is sort of looked at generally as a field that is for good, but there are lots of instances where preservation has neutrality, or preservation sort of only works for itself, or preservation sort of works for corporate interests. And I came back after working on Hurricane Harvey recovery really thinking that I no longer wanted to sort of do work that was just neutral within preservation.
When talking about your story, it sounds like you had a story of discovery. You were trying to figure out what you wanted to do in a rough time during the recession. I liked how in the beginning you did end up going to India. I feel like that really kind of drove some of the decisions you ended up making when coming back, even though I know it was difficult when you first got back. And I feel like just during your entire journey, you were just trying to try new things and entering pockets you didn't even know existed within preservation. But eventually you found your niche in disaster recovery. But it did let me like thinking, because I know you are also a writer. Can you talk about what your writing journey was like as well?
I really enjoyed writing my blog as just a way in which to engage with the field and engage with topics that I wasn't even sort of working on directly. Since I started the blog, I've kind of thought about writing as this appendage of my practice as an architectural historian. And it feels really good to say architectural historian and writer. People all over architecture, not just preservation, but all over architecture are, multi-hyphenates. Like, we have to figure out a way to sort of be a polymaths. Like, even Jonathan's grandfather was an architect, but also sort of doing collage work. I love knowing that people have sort of a career focus, but then this other thing. So writing has always been an appendage of my practice. And as I was writing Blasius, I started to have some opportunities to do writing and have my writing published. And before this, my mom always said, like, oh, Elizabeth, you're such a good writer. Your mom says things to you, and it's like, okay, Mom, thanks. But my mom wanted to be a journalist. And, like, journalism was never something that was available to my mom. But, I always really enjoyed writing, and I enjoyed the process of writing. I never feel like it's a slog. I always feel like it's a discovery. So I was writing Blasius, and I was doing a little bit of freelance writing, and then Matt Messner, at the time he was the Midwest editor of Architects newspaper. So he came to me and he said, I'm stepping down, would you be interested in this? And I don't have a journalism background. I remember, one of the editors at Architects newspaper being very frustrated with me because I was still using 2 spaces after a period. And she was like, Elizabeth, do 1 space, please, 1 space. So it was a really kind of a hard road for the first couple of months of being an editor at Architects newspaper, because I was not only writing for them, but I was also sort of processing stories in the Midwest and managing some freelance content. I'm very proud of some of the articles that I wrote for Architects newspaper. I'm also proud of some of the stories that broke while I was editor. One of the stories being related to IIT. There was some work being done outside of Crown Hall, and the work revealed some really beautiful tiles from Mecca Flats. And Joseph Alschuler, who was a professor at IIT at the time, brought this story to me, and I was like, oh, this is so great. This is totally up my alley. Archaeology, preservation, this lost piece of Chicago history. And I think that Joseph, breaking that story sort of really broke open a deeper discussion about IIT and the effects that IIT have had on the built environment. And that was the kind of story that I was really proud of. It was also the kind of story that I really was attracted to. And I didn't grow up reading any sort of architecture writing, but in Chicago, this was a time when Blair Kamen was the architecture writer for the Tribune, and reading some of Blair's pieces and thinking about what criticism is. How can you do a combination of architectural journalism, very deeply researched stories, stuff that has your perspective, but then kind of hit people with a little bit of criticism, like whether it's soft criticism or hard criticism, or just really putting an institution on notice in terms of their choices. And writing about architecture and writing about preservation for Architects newspaper, for other outlets like Curbed Chicago, writing op-eds really allows me to do that.
Criticism is actually a huge theme that I'm starting to see in both of your guys' stories. So let's talk a little bit about how these stories end up coming together. So how did you guys meet?
Jonathan and I met in 2017 during the sort of last little bits of that biennial cycle. And I was invited to participate in a panel about the James R. Thompson Center. And I think that I was a substitute for someone that couldn't make it. I had written about the Thompson Center both as a freelancer and did sort of various advocacy activities on my own and was really interested in the building. My first interaction with the Thompson Center was working in the service industry. The state liquor licenses used to come from the Thompson Center as a state building. So I was working at this restaurant once in my early 20s and had to go to the Thompson Center to get a piece of paperwork for their liquor license. And I remember just really being in awe of the building, the fact that it was a public building, that it was so strange. And there was some discussion during graduate school about the Thompson Center sort of being the future of historic preservation. And, at that point, there had been, several rounds of discussion between preservationists and the state of Illinois about the building's future. So I was invited to speak on this panel, and Jonathan was on the panel with me. And I was like, wow, this guy is really interesting. He has really interesting opinions about the Thompson Center. He's really smart. I thought he was cool. I liked his glasses. He had very cool style, but it was really just, how he was framing the Thompson Center as a public building, as a public asset, and how he was talking about the architecture was really interesting to me and was much more interesting than a lot of the other ways that people were talking about the Thompson Center.
I had almost a mirror of that experience. I actually don't remember the content of our discussion very well, or the other panelists, although I remember being frustrated with some of them. Sometimes you show up on these panels and you are essentially reading from a script, right? And everybody else is too. And they're just not very lively, right? And in this case, I felt like Elizabeth was a guy who had passionate feelings about the building, really kind of cared about it and had thought about it specifically in the context of the questions and discussion that we were having. And that thinking was sophisticated. Now, I remember that our co-panelists were making an argument that this just wasn't Jan's best building, that maybe there were other Jan buildings that were better to save, that the building didn't have popular support, or it wasn't loved, or that it didn't function. Well, there were a whole sort of series of tropes about the Thompson Center over the years that were sort of easy to repeat in public if you were covetous of that land and wanted to make money off of it, but that didn't really represent its history, its value, or its potentials. And I thought Elizabeth did see those. And so in the audience at that panel was our friend Kiefer Dunn, who at the time had a radio show called Buildings on Air that was also a podcast. And he invited us to come on and talk about the Thompson Center there. And so we met again and had a chance to kind of reconnect. My connection to the Thompson Center goes back to my origin stories. So I mentioned earlier, my parents divorced when I was young. My mother, 1984, 1985, had never had a job. She'd been married from a young age, had to go out and get work. And she found a job with a state agency. Her first month of work was packing up the old offices somewhere on Wabash Ave to move to the new State of Illinois building, which would later become the Thompson Center. I was there from age 7 onward in one form or another. I would go with my mother on days that I didn't have school, but that she had to work. And at that time, you could move throughout the building freely, even as a child, right? Or perhaps especially. But you could ride up and down the elevators. I would raid the supply closets for things like Post-it notes, which were also kind of brand new in 1985. And later, even I would ride the bus after school to meet her there and do homework in the food court and things like that. So I really had very visceral and fond memories of discovering it, of experiencing it as a building that embodied the future very explicitly, right? Which was very much part of its brief. And I saw value in it as an artifact, right? I saw value in it because it was an artifact of a moment in Helmut Jahn's career when he was still invested in questions of architectural language, the relationship of the architectural surface, the building, before he moved sort of fully into seamless, high-tech sort of smoothness. It was an artifact of a moment in the history of building technology, frankly, where the public was eager to see it as a failure or as a waste. I was aware of situations like the Chicago Cultural Center, right, which in the 1970s was called a failure and a waste and inefficient, right, and gaudy and ugly. So I was aware that style and aesthetics and opinions about those things really didn't matter, right? This was an important building because of the ways in which the public experienced it failing, right? Because it's an example of early integration of large-scale strategies for lighting and cooling buildings that were experimental at the time. Today, you can walk into a Helmut Jahn building and it's seamless. You don't even recognize that the temperature, the humidity, the sounds and smells and everything are being carefully calibrated and controlled for your comfort. In the Thompson Center, those systems didn't always work. And so you were very much aware of them. My mother was working there during the summers when it was 95 degrees in the atrium, And it was on the evening news. I've spoken about feeling like the building was almost like a supervillain. It had the city in its thrall somehow, right? For all the ways in which it was just disturbing people's lives. I thought it was amazing that a building could have that kind of power and impact. Not that buildings should be uncomfortable for people, but that this made it a thing that was historically significant and worthy of understanding and saving. That's a way of saying both Elizabeth and I had very complex thoughts about the building and a certain innate love for it. Our next step, in effect, would come a couple of years later, right? Like Elizabeth and I met around that building. We became friends. We started spending more time together. Elizabeth took me on a great tour of the Thompson Center at one point, which, again, public building, you could walk in to the theater in the basement. We could walk into the conference rooms on the second floor with this amazing collection of Chicago Imagist art just hanging on the walls, right? And piled in corners even. I'm getting off track here. But in any event, the next time we met was a little bit later, and it was after I had kind of gone through a career transformation of my own that set me up to be open to working together. First in a kind of an informal and volunteer capacity, and then ultimately opening an office together. I had been teaching and running the program in Hong Kong. I'd moved briefly through Syracuse University as associate dean back to Chicago to be professor and director in the Department of Architecture, Interior Architecture, and Designed Objects at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. This was a dream job. This was everything I wanted. I was back home. I was in a venerable institution with an incredible history and with superb resources and reputation, with some extraordinary colleagues. And I was being given the trust to shape and guide where that relatively young program in the ecosystem of Chicago architecture schools would go, right? And I had come back to Chicago because I wanted to feel rooted and I wanted to be connected to my place in a way that I couldn't be in Hong Kong, and to be effective in place. And it turned out that that was also the market segment, if you will, for schools in Chicago at the time. Neither IIT nor UIC were doing the kind of work or foregrounding the kind of work that was being done by a rising generation of Chicago architects and Chicago critics, I would argue. Chicago had become a center of architectural criticism, and it had become a center of a certain type of practice that was deeply embedded in its own context, whether that meant it was working on existing buildings or whether that meant it was working very directly and very closely with the communities that would be occupying the spaces that architecture produced in order to produce them. And I really felt like there was a confluence of effort and energy around that. 5 years after taking on that job, I just couldn't do it anymore. I had gotten the school into some, I think, very positive opportunities. We took the school to the Venice Architecture Biennial. We brought the school into closer connection to its alumni community, close connection to its professional community. We brought the school into discourse with the nation and the world around what was happening in Chicago. But the costs of doing that work for me personally were really great. And like in Hong Kong, this work that was supposed to be what I loved most turned out to be work that I could do well in some areas and couldn't do well in every area. I hit limits. I hit really hard limits in the same places that I did in Hong Kong, in my ability to kind of bring along my most immediate community, the community of the school itself, with the project that I felt so deeply about and that I could clearly impact in other arenas, right? Nationally, professionally, globally, whatever it was. And I really experienced that as a failure. I felt it and experienced it as a failure. It had impacts on me, it had impacts on the people I was working with, and I just felt that I couldn't do it anymore. That was a very hard realization for me because it was A, it was what I loved doing, and B, it was what I had put all my time into learning how to do and practicing. And I felt a kind of what you would classically refer to as a midlife crisis. I felt a kind of like terror at having nothing to fall back on. All I wanted to do, right? The way that the world of academia works, the value is often extremely intangible, right? The value is often totally reputational. It's what do people think of what you've done, not,
nothing you can really put your hand on or measure. And all I wanted to do after leaving that, I left to take a sabbatical in May of 2019, my first sabbatical in 14 years of full-time teaching, right? And all I wanted to do was just dive into something tangible. But I had never had a really tangible practice, let alone doing things with my own hands. I am not handy. I don't, right? A lot of architects have a kind of practice of drawing or making that, that fills this for them. And it's never a thing that I was really able to do. I was never a person who made things with my hands in that way. I didn't feel like I had a developed writing practice at that stage. It was editing, it was curating. I didn't feel like I had a developed design practice because that had never been my focus. And at that precise moment, it was actually Elizabeth and I have a friend, AJ Latrace, who suggested that we come together and do some kind of project around the Thompson Center, around our kind of mutual love of the Thompson Center. And that felt real and tangible. It felt like it could be on the ground, it could be direct, I could be engaging in an effort that had a potential outcome that would benefit the city, that wasn't about me, my project, my effort to run the school. I could be a little bit in the background of the larger effort, and it felt really tangible, and I felt a kind of innate interest and desire to be working with Elizabeth and AJ on this. Elizabeth, AJ, and I came together and founded something collectively called the James R. Thompson Center Historical Society.
So right around the time that I had met Jonathan and we had became friends, I had met AJ Latrace, who would be the co-founder of the James R. Thompson Center Historical Society. I had been back from Texas for a while. I was in Chicago doing consulting work, but I'd never really scratched the itch of being able to work in Chicago on something that I could kind of really sink my teeth into. Part of that was working in preservation. People don't retire. At this point, a lot of the professionals that had been presented to me during grad school were still working, and they're still working now. So preservation it's been hard for me to kind of crack, and I think throughout my professional career, I've always sort of felt like I was on the fringes of the profession. I always felt like anything that I wanted to work on in Chicago would have to be self-initiated, and the drive for me to want to work on something in Chicago really made the James R. Thompson Center Historical Society very exciting. First off, we were fulfilling this need that presented itself to talk about the building as a significant public space. We were talking about the building differently. One of the sort of core things that the James R. Thompson Center Historical Society was doing was giving public tours of the building. So every week at noon, on a Wednesday, people would show up for our free tours, and we would give a tour of the building. And we talk about the building as an architecturally significant place. We talk about postmodernism. We talk about Helmut Jahn, but we'd also talk about things like public buildings and how public buildings belong to the people that the public buildings are located in. We connected the Thompson Center and the efforts to save it with other previous efforts of preservation advocacy, like the Chicago Cultural Center, which was saved in the 1970s from demolition. When we kind of compared some of the hate that the building was getting in terms of its design and its lack of functionality, we compared that to a lot of the discussions that were happening in the 60s and 70s about buildings of the Chicago school that were coming down. So folks were saying that these buildings are obsolete, they're no longer worth sort of caring for or preserving, or they passed their usable life. And a lot of those same tropes we were hearing about the Thompson Center. So the tours really gave us an opportunity to talk about the history of historic preservation in context with the Thompson Center, but then to also kind of talk about the ways that the Thompson Center had been used by the public. And one of the things that I'm sort of very proud of that's now kind of been integrated in the story of the Thompson Center, I think that we initiated a discussion about, was that it was a place of protest and a place of activism. So the Thompson Center being located where it was within the North Loop, across from the city-county building, across from a federal building, people were using the Thompson Center to talk to their government, whether that's state, local, or federal, about any number of sort of initiatives that they either liked or didn't like. And it was really interesting to sort of do that research to learn that an organization like ACT UP from the 1980s went to the Thompson Center to protest Cook County Health's lack of care for AIDS patients. So bringing out that history was really important. I feel like people kind of weren't aware of the way in which the Thompson Center was really used in this fantastic way for free speech and for protest. And bringing that out was something that was really exciting for me. And it was also exciting, I think, for the audience of the folks that were interested in taking the tours. So we gave the tours. We also did sort of briefly a podcast called Conversations in the Food Court, where we would invite, mostly our friends to come down to the food court of the Thompson Center and sit and talk about public space. And it was really fun, and it was very, there was always a lot of activity around the podcast because we just did it right in the food court, right in this public space. It was really exciting to participate in something that felt very new and fresh, and really felt like there was sort of a need for this kind of discussion about the Thompson Center.
So the Thompson Center ended up becoming like this connection point between you guys, especially your admiration for it. When did the conversations about creating a firm start to come up?
When the statewide lockdown happened, we were no longer able to give tours of the Thompson Center. So Jonathan and AJ and I kind of, looked at each other and we were like, okay, well, what are we going to do now? And the decision was made to write a National Register nomination for the Thompson Center. The National Register of Historic Places designation would allow a level of scholarship to kind of be generated around the Thompson Center. It's a very complex document. It goes to the National Park Service. We felt like there was help the advocacy effort by sort of providing a little bit of a check and balance around what the state would ultimately do to the building. So we decided we would write a National Register nomination. We did a little bit of fundraising for it. We got some money from Mark Realty, the managers of the food court at the time. They were so sort of incensed by what was happening at the state level and the neglect of the building that they were like, oh yeah, we'll give you some money to write this National Register nomination. We approached Elaine Rosen, who gave us a little bit of money, and then Landmarks Illinois also gave us a little bit of money to write the National Register nomination. Sort of started writing it, and Jonathan and I kind of found that through that work, we really enjoyed working together. It was so easy to work with Jonathan, and our thinking seemed to always be kind of in lockstep, and we really sort of trusted each other. We trusted each other's decisions. We respected each other in this wonderful way. And we were also friends. So we were in the process of writing the National Register nomination, and AJ had to step back. And Jonathan and I sort of completed the National Register nomination just as the two of us. And writing the National Register nomination, we both kind of saw a need for what we were doing with the Thompson Center, but at a larger scale. Preservation was sort of interested in postmodernism. It was interested in architectural styles of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it really wasn't engaging with that. And, there were also sort of holes in preservation that I had observed through years as a consultant. Preservation was really not paying attention to vernacular architecture or underrepresented histories. Preservation was sort of aware of that, but didn't really engage, particularly in the private sector. So preservation nonprofits and preservation as, a movement was aware that there were holes in the discipline. And the private sector was really sort of not doing anything. And we kind of decided that we could have a firm that focused on underrepresented histories, later architectural styles, where preservation wasn't present but should be. And that's how Preservation Futures was created.
So you guys started your firm. Can you talk a little bit more about the beginning and what it meant to found the firm and understand your guys' mission?
Yes. Preservation was not a thing that was on my radar, to be honest, as a profession. I certainly was doing work all through my career that was focused on themes that preservation takes very seriously. But if you had asked me at any point previously to founding Preservation Futures, if I considered myself a preservationist, I would have said no. I discovered something pretty special about preservation as I began to understand how it operates as a profession through my work with Elizabeth early on and conversations with Elizabeth. We talk often about the need to check the forces of the market in architecture, right? The environment that I was brought up through saw architecture's own internal disciplinarity as that check
right? That the way that architecture preserved a kind of disciplinary autonomy for itself, right? A set of values about what a good or an interesting or a valuable building was, separate from the way the market valued it, was by establishing that value within a community of architects, within a sort of value system that we architects kind of control and populate. And it was that discourse that I originally had been so drawn to as a student. That discourse, it turns out, is extremely weak. It has a great deal of strength within narrow parts of its own community, but it's an intangible strength. It's a strength that rests on relationship and reputation more than it rests on actual material barriers to the action of the market. I had been, again, brought up to be suspicious of for-profit ventures in architecture at a kind of baseline level. I formed and ran 2 nonprofits prior to Preservation Futures. I was really invested in the alternatives to the way in which the market grabbed architecture by the throat and led it, forced it in one direction or another. And so when Elizabeth's suggestion that we found essentially a for-profit preservation consultancy, I was initially apprehensive. I thought initially that maybe a nonprofit would be appropriate, since that seemed to be what happened in preservation anyway. And then very quickly in discussion, we realized that we had to take the opposite approach, that we had to have a practice that worked in the market. In other words, like it worked in the for-profit space, not because we wanted to reap tremendous profits, although Elizabeth and I talk often about how through Preservation Futures we intend to be both rich and famous, but because we wanted to find people who valued preservation enough to pay for it, right? And who saw preservation as capable of working within and for the built environment, using the market to arrest the market or to control to the performance of the market, right? So we exist in a time today where those forces seem unconfrontable, but they're not, right? Preservation actually is that one space in built environment practice where you can put a brake on capitalism. And I think that's what made the nomination process for the Thompson Center so exciting. It's that, on the one hand, we were advocates. We were trying to change public opinion. We were trying to talk about values embedded in the building that were being ignored, and particularly public values: space to protest, space to get a cheap meal, public restrooms, all of that, free Wi-Fi. But also, we were able to produce a document that had the potential to enter the legal system and stop the process of the state. And that revealed a tremendous amount of potential, right, I think, to us.
One thing that you just said that really stuck out to me was how you wanted to bring more value to preservation. And so in your guys' work, you guys do challenge what conventional preservation is. So can you talk a little bit more about what that means to you guys and how preservation can be activism as well?
Preservation is a multitude of things. Preservation is a field of practice. So there's the physical preservation of buildings. So you're, cleaning mortar or deciding what kind of materials to clean the mortar of a building with, or the facade of a building with. There's research and preservation. So there's the writing of a National Register nomination or the writing of a local designation. There's preservation as government. So local governments have a preservation division. They have policies and ordinances that dictate what can and cannot happen to buildings. There's also preservation nonprofits that sort of lead the charge for advocacy and help both the public and the private sector decide how preservation is executed. But then there's also volunteers in preservation. So preservation is all of these different things. It's a field of practice. It's a field of study. It's physical preservation. Preservation has multitudes that architecture maybe does not. One thing that I think that is very interesting about preservation and architecture, just looking at them together, is that no one would ever expect an architect to work for free, But folks expect preservationists to work for free all of the time, or preservation to sort of function for free. There's always this trope that we hear, oh, well, you care about a building so much, well, you should buy it and you should preserve it. But then there's also a disconnection in terms of the labor of preservation. And part of that is, the fact that it developed into a field as an activist movement. So, a lot of the folks that were originally doing preservation in, you could say, the 1930s and the 1960s, the first wave and the second wave, before the professionalization of the field, we're doing it as volunteers. So we've always sort of looked at preservation as preservation futures as a service profession. And the work for a service should be paid for by someone that cares.
And it should be responsive to a client, right? I think that a lot of the charges of elitism that come against preservation are the result of an approach that is, in quotes, charitable and also disconnected from the community, right? So when a nonprofit preservation advocacy group comes to your town and says, you can't do that with that building because it has this value that you didn't know about, but that we're here to tell you about, that is not the kind of work we want to do, right? We want to be in service to clients who want our help to preserve or adapt or interpret their space, right? And I think that the for-profit structure gives us that dependency. It translates us from a charitable project or an advocacy project, which is top-down, which is driven by our values. It transforms us into a mission-driven service profession where we are seeking out clients whose missions we believe in and providing services to them that they value and pay us for, right? And I think that transforms the work completely. And that does look a little bit more like the way an architect operates, right? An architect serves a client. By the way, we founded our firm in 2021. We've just passed our 5-year anniversary. We're also architects. I'm a licensed architect in the state of Illinois, and Preservation Futures is registered as a professional design firm in the state of Illinois. We've done a little bit of design work. That work was done in collaboration, even that little bit of work that we did. It's not where we want to put the emphasis of our efforts, but the public understands what an architect does and how an architect operates and where an architect has authorship and impact. And we actually find that the ability to describe ourselves as architects makes it easier often to engage with a client, with the public, with the city in conversations that we want to and need to have on behalf of our clients.
You were talking about the impact of preservation, and I want to know, who does preservation respond to? I remember when you were talking about your past, you said that you have worked at places where they served mainly the client and only the client's needs. But then the work you guys do, it sounds like, since they're more community-based, do they serve the community or the client, or a little bit of both?
I think in our case, the community is the client. That's the best condition. And we've been able to set up conditions like that in different ways. Elizabeth mentioned earlier that we wanted to be, as a firm, in the places that preservation wasn't. And I think one of the places that preservation is, and primarily is, and this isn't the fault of preservationists per se, it has to do with how the laws around preservation are written. One of the places preservation is in service of developers who want to maximize profits and want to take advantage of an allowance in federal law that offers tax incentives for redeveloping historic buildings. The intentions of that are good, but the results are that any old building ought to be able to be made historic, right? Wink, wink, if we want to make money. And that's not work we're particularly interested in. We're interested in being in spaces where preservation can have a different kind of purview and reach. For us, that's been so far really two different areas. One is the architecture of the relatively recent past, broadly speaking, right? That's a territory where, and I'm talking 50 years or less, buildings that are 50 years old or less, buildings from the 70s onward. We worked in Joliet, Illinois, for a coalition of stakeholders there who wanted to preserve the former Will County Courthouse
a 1960s brutalist, beautiful building designed by C.F. Murphy here in Chicago, and transform it into a boutique hotel, right? And there was a clear need for this. There were development partners who were eager to participate, and I'm sure would have made profits. But we saw a value in that. Our engagement in it and our sense of its value was a broad coalition in the community of Joliet coming together and saying, just because you don't like the way this thing looks or the style seems weird to you doesn't negate its embedded value, either as a work of architecture, as a pile of concrete, as anything else, right? The other area we found ourselves working is in narratives that are not part of the mainstream national narrative. And this is actually where the vast majority of our work has been. For us, over the last 4 years, primarily, it has meant Black history in Chicago. We had, through personal interests and engagements on both of our parts, 2 early projects that came our way. One was working on Chicago's oldest house, formerly the Clark House, now the Clark Ford House, thanks to Elizabeth's efforts, and on Emmett Mamie Till House in West Woodlawn here in Chicago also. Those projects were, again, brought to us, or we came into contact with through groups that were embedded long-term in the context of the projects that they were interested in saving and had personal connections to. In the case of the Clark Ford House, it was Bishop Ford's grandson, Pastor Kevin Anthony Ford, who was leading that effort, and his faith community that was leading that effort, right? In the case of the Till House, Naomi Davis and Blackson Green, and ultimately the Till Institute, the Till family, was leading that project. For us, those are spaces where preservation classically, I think, would have said, and in fact classically did say, this history doesn't have value, right? Preservation actually very explicitly rejected the connection that Bishop Ford and Church of God in Christ had to the Clark Ford House and said it wasn't valuable and replaced it with the history of the Clark family. Preservation, Chicago did a survey in the 1980s and early 90s of all the historic properties in the city. Al Capone's house was on that survey, right? But Emmett Till's house was not. It didn't exist at all on that survey. So preservationists must have looked at it and said it's not valuable, or they must have not had access to information that it even existed, right? And in either case, that was a failing. Not a personal failing on anybody's part, but it was a systemic failing. So being able to find those clients and take on those projects, I think for us, is the epitome of what we want preservation future.
We find clients. A lot of times our work is sort of self-initiated in a way. We see a need for us to kind of, step in, whether it's briefly in and out in terms of an advocacy effort, or sort of a larger relationship with a steward of a historic building or a community member who cares about a building. And clients come to us all the time and they'll say, we're aware of your work on the Clark Ford House, or we're aware of your work at the Till House. We want to work with you. How do we work with you? And we kind of work with them to determine ways in which they can pay for our services through folks, foundations, resources that have deep pockets. So, we're not taking the services of preservation that we provide, we're not taking that out of the money for the physical restoration or any sort of coordination that client does. And we've been fairly successful in terms of seeding projects in this way and putting together resources and finding folks that want to pay for preservation, have resources to pay for preservation. But maybe this particular funder has never worked on a preservation project, or even, like a lot of our clients sort of come to us, they've never worked with preservationists before. They've never worked with listing on the National Register or a local designation or, any sort of interpretation. And that's kind of where we like to work. As Jonathan said, preservation is really sort of geared itself towards building and preserving capital for, a lot of developers, for building owners. And that's not really space that we want to work in. And in fact, I think that we're a little bit suspicious of that part of mainstream preservation. We kind of want to work outside of that. And at the same time, I feel like when big preservation projects that are involved with tax credits and are at a large scale, The architects, the developers, the folks that are responsible for that project, they're already set with working with particular preservation firms, and that might not be us. And we might not ever get projects at a large scale, but I feel like in the 5 years that we've been in business as Preservation Futures, we've really worked on preservation projects that have really mattered, and we've developed relationships with clients that many of our clients have come back to us, even in 5 years, 2-3 times, to do different projects, and that really feels very, very satisfying and very profound.
We want to bring value to preservation, and I think very literally, like, we become grant writers, right? We become project managers for our clients. And it's not grants for us, it's grants for our clients, right? In order to support them in paying for our services and other services, and to build relationships with the grant givers, right? We have and would work with developers. The client for the Will County Courthouse was a developer. Blacks and Green is a developer in West Woodlawn, among other things. One of the things we say is that preservation is development. Preservation is a form of development. It's a different kind of development. We don't want to be cynical. We don't want preservation to be simply yet another rung on the ladder to profit, right? We want to use the systems of the development market to support the care of the built environment, right? And not its destruction. Yeah.
That leads into my next question about your guys' design process. What does it look like? Where does research fit in, design fit in?
Can I talk to that a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that until very recently, preservation was a bit of a dirty word in architecture circles, certainly in development circles, right? Preservation was seen as an obstruction to development, and still is in some areas of discourse. For designers, preservation was seen as a barrier to a design vision, somehow. And worse, it was the enemy of the new. Right? And the new really is where any architect would want to be, right? I say until recently because both broadly today, meaning in the market at large, and in more kind of elite conversations amongst and between architects, the existing building is now suddenly a very fertile territory, right? At some point during COVID, the percentage of architectural billing hours on existing work surpassed architectural billing hours on new work. If you have an architect sitting in front of you in your podcast today, they are very likely to be talking about work that they're doing on existing buildings and even work that they're doing on historic buildings. And we think that's amazing. The larger design project, I would say, if I can be a little bit transcendent for a moment, that we're trying to address is the problem of the fetishization of the new. And frankly, of progress. And to do that in Chicago is very apt because Chicago is a city defined by modernity, by progress, and by the incessant march of the new. Our culture prioritizes, almost fetishizes the new. We put a tremendous amount of respect the arrival of a new iPhone or on the construction of a new building. We put no effort into repairing iPhones. In fact, it's impossible to repair an iPhone. And we really look down on the people and the processes that maintain buildings, right? The people who clean and repair and practice upkeep in buildings. We see things that are even vaguely used, and we refer to them as shabby or as out of date. And that's the thing that we're trying to change. It has to be cultural, and it affects everything. It affects how we use our resources. It affects how we conceive of our place in the arc of history and how the past connects to the future through the present. It certainly affects the way that we steward our climate and our environment and care for one another as a culture and provide for one another as a culture. What does that mean from the perspective of design? I think it means that if you build something new, we think that it should be done very carefully, right? With a tremendous amount of thought and care. And if you tear something down, you should be very, very careful that what you're tearing down can't be saved, right? I don't think that we feel that new construction is always bad or that nothing should ever be demolished. Those are not realistic positions, and they would create problems of their own. We just believe that they need to be done with much more thought and care than we currently do it. The opportunities that we've had to interface directly with design, our efforts have been to create spaces that integrate the past and the present and the possibility of the future. stylistically, materially, spatially, right? And it's a research-driven effort. For us, that research can be research into periods and styles, yes, but primarily it's research into people and what they value and what they remember about the environments that were meaningful to them or the environments that we're entrusted with.
When a new building is presented or proposed, there's renderings, there's drawings. There really isn't anything like that for care or maintenance. Care and maintenance isn't sexy. It's not something that you can represent in a rendering. It's something that just kind of happens. And we feel like preservation is development, preservation is design. Preservation is kind of more of a design mindset than, for us, a series of regulations that you need to consider. And, of course, there are regulations. If a building is a local landmark, there are certain parameters in terms of how that building can be changed. But, there's also a thoughtfulness in terms of the care and maintenance of the existing built environment that we consider to be design. And preservation, of course, has existed outside of the professionalization of the field for as long as people have occupied buildings and built them. I recently learned about an adaptive reuse of the Great Pyramid at Giza. This scholarly idea now that it was a power generator. It was sort of a power plant. And afterwards, it was adaptively reused as, a place where kings and queens were put to rest. So that really got me thinking about the profound nature of adaptive reuse as preservation. And there are certainly people that will, sort of debate the details, but preservation has been going on for, as long as humans have occupied buildings. And in Chicago, I feel like there's a great legacy of preservation that happened way before the professionalization of the movement. So, you have immigrants coming from elsewhere and occupying buildings and caring for them and preserving their histories and sort of adding a material layer. In Chicago, we have this great legacy of the Great Migration, African Americans coming from the South and occupying buildings as their homes, as their businesses, only in specific areas of Chicago, and doing a kind of preservation without barriers, landmarking, listing on the National Register, just sort of doing it as an act of existence. We look at preservation very broadly, and we consider the research process and learning about a building and learning about its history is kind of, in a way to inform how its future is told.
Well, first, I want to thank you guys for being on this podcast. We're getting to the end of the episode, so a few more questions to wrap up the episode. I really enjoyed the way that we were able to take a step into this and talk about your guys' stories, and then end up on understanding what the process looks like for preservation. So do you guys have any advice for anyone also interested in preservation or breaking that boundary of preservation?
I think architecture actually remains a really vital path, and that if you're interested in preservation, one of the most effective spaces to have an impact on it is in the space of architecture. Right? Architects have an opportunity when they interact with a client to direct a project in a variety of ways. They don't always have the broadest of autonomy, right? But they have an opportunity for influence. And I think that if you are educated and knowledgeable about the ways in which preservation can actually bring value to design and development, you can be really effective in the space of architecture and, frankly, in the space of development. And I think that we need people in both of those spaces who are exerting that influence to see change. I think that there's also, if you're interested or engaged in politics, really at any level, I think that it's fundamentally, I think preservation is a progressive project in the sense that preservation supports an accessible, a just, a plentiful, and a environmentally responsible use of the built environment at its best. Preservation can do that. It can be a tool in reaching that end. So if you're in that space, I think also kind of being knowledgeable about maintaining what we already have can play in providing resources that we need, right? And not always looking to something new to solve that problem or to deliver on that need.
There's a sort of idea that if you study history or if you study historic buildings, that your value is sort of not in ideas, but it's in, okay, well, how many Louis Sullivan buildings can you name? When were they built? Who preserved them? So like knowing sort of dates and architects, I feel like is less important to me in the field of preservation than having really interesting ideas and sort of pulling ideas from outside of the field, where you come from, what your values are, what the values are of the community that you come from, what does preservation mean to you, as opposed to just spitting out dates and architects verbatim. And that really doesn't matter to me. And I think that it matters less to the field than really thinking about how we take the ideas of preservation and the spirit of preservation into what we do, whether it's saving a building or caring for a building quite simply by, cleaning the outside. Ideas are much more important than straight up facts about architecture. I feel like as a young person, as a professional, as a woman, I encounter this all the time where I'm a subject matter expert and somebody talks to me about something that I've written about, that I've worked about. So this happens to me all the time where I'm the subject matter expert. I have written about a building extensively. I have worked in the space where that building is preserved and cared for and researched. But someone will come to me and talk to me about that particular building or that concept like I'm 5. And sometimes I look at that as gendered. I feel like it's ageist. And I really hope that I'm sort of at the end of the age group where people like me are looked at not as subject matter experts, because subject matter expertise comes in lots of different ways. It's ideas, it's thinking about themes, it's thinking about the future. It's not just regurgitating facts about a building.
Yeah, it's passion, right? If you care about something, that's worth a tremendous amount. And Louis Sullivan is an important architect. That legacy is extremely valuable. We value it. But fundamentally, preservation values it because a group of preservationists really cared about that work. Right? And if you really care about something and you can find other people who really care about it, you can elevate that thing into the historical canon, just like Louis Sullivan was elevated into the historical canon. You can make it relevant to the world. And that's more valuable than chasing after what other people value, is what Elizabeth is really advocating for.
I really like that. I really do. And I feel like some of the things you also mentioned are sadly just part of the system. But I think always being able to know what you're passionate for and what you bring to the table, your value, is very important. So thanks for saying that. Thank you for giving us some advice, because I know this is an ongoing conversation. This conversation was really cool to me because I didn't really know that much about preservation. I know a lot more about adaptive reuse, but I feel like preservation is what we think adaptive reuse isn't, even though they're very almost the same.
Right, there isn't a rule book here. And I think that I was at IIT to hear Deborah Burke talk about her work last year, and she really kind of dug into preservation as something that was too restrictive in comparison to her work, which she posits as adaptive reuse. And we don't really want to get caught up in that kind of talk, right? It doesn't really matter to us what you call it. There are moments where the literal physical materiality and authenticity of stone is valuable. And there are moments where it's really not. There are moments where a change to a building is really destructive and unnecessary and shouldn't be done even as part of its adaptation to a new use. And there are moments where it can't be done and it's fine, right? It's hard to be overly ideological in preservation because each case is so unique.
Yeah.
And really just has to be, again, looked at carefully, which, we think Deborah Burke's work absolutely falls under the category of preservation, for example, right? In certain parts of our field, it would be looked at as, otherwise.
I think what I like about your guys' work too is, it's called Preservation Futures, so it's not just about preservation, but also preserving what's going to happen in the future.
If I could say one thing about Preservation Futures.
Yeah.
We decided to name our firm Preservation Futures not to sort of state that we are the future. And sometimes people misinterpret that, like we're sort of putting the field on notice for naming our firm Preservation Futures. But, we really want Jonathan and I as a collective, as workers in preservation, to really explore what the future of preservation has in store for us.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good, at least that's from what I understood from your guys' name. And I'm glad you mentioned it, because I know it could be interpreted that way. But now to turn it around and actually talk about your guys' futures, what do you guys have in store for the future?
Oh gosh, what's in store for the future?
For the immediate future, I'm going to get a second cup of coffee and a nice big breakfast.
Oh yeah, breakfast would be good.
Yeah.
But the broader future, I'm so proud of the work that we're doing, and I feel like it's so great to sort of carve out a space within the field of preservation and architecture where our ideas and our services are really respected and needed. We're really excited to sort of integrate more design into our practice. We're a very collaborative firm. We're very collaborative individuals. We're also very creative individuals, which I think is, one of the ways in which we initially connected. Jonathan is an active drawer and doodler, and is also such a gifted curator that it's great to sort of have curatorial experience in a preservation firm, to think about how preservation can not only be design development, but it can also be curation. So I'm very excited for a future where we're meeting more clients and working with more fantastic individuals, but then also a future where we're infusing even more creativity into what we do.
I think that's a great answer. I feel the same way. I think, from a business perspective, we're looking now at ways in which we can partner with other firms to broaden the range in which we're working. So whether it's partnering with our architecture colleagues, whether it's partnering with larger consulting firms, looking at ways that we can move our work. We've done work in the region and more nationally, but ways that we can move our work into new areas and new fields and build new relationships. And
Thank you guys for being here on this episode. Thank you for letting me know more about your guys' story, more about the work you guys do, your guys' beliefs. It was really interesting to understand the path that you guys took to get to where you guys are now. And I'm so excited to see what your guys' future becomes. So thank you guys for being on this episode. And I hope you guys continue doing the things you guys do.
Thank you for having us. And congratulations for 3 years. My goodness, that's no small feat. So we're really excited for the next 3 years of the Beyond the Surface podcast.
Thank you.
thanks for having us.
Thank you. Yeah. I want to thank everyone for listening. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can follow us on Instagram at beyondthesurface_designpod, or find us at beyondthesurfacepodcast.org. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwalik, and the Beyond the Surface team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface, featuring Elizabeth Blasius and Jonathan Solomon. Until next time, goodbye.